Welcome to this presentation titled The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory's Case for Government-Issued Money. I'm Edward J. Dodson. There have always been critics of how the money of every society is created. A group of economics professors and others outside the discipline have in recent years emerged with arguments that began in the late 19th century regarding the role of money in an economy. Challenging their mainstream colleagues, these economists emphasize that money is actually a creature of law rather than a simple medium of exchange determined by market forces. Left to right, Steve Keen, Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, and L. Randall Wray are among a growing list of heterodox, that is, outside the mainstream economists, who challenge what they were taught about the creation of money and about how monetary policy affects how wealth is produced and distributed in a society. Here's the starting point. Our monetary system today has no direct relationship, as it once had, to a nation's storehouse of gold and silver. The so-called gold standard is no more. Governments today all utilize a fiat currency, meaning that the currency is not a receipt evidencing an ownership claim on any particular tangible asset. The most highly visible proponent of MMT today is economics professor Stephanie Kelton, who served in 2016 as chief economic advisor to Bernie Sanders and is on the faculty of Stony Brook University in New York. In her book, The Deficit Myth, she challenges what she describes as serious myths regarding money, deficits, and public debt. She writes, the core idea behind MMT may have initially appeared outlandish, but it proved to be descriptively accurate. In one sense, MMT is a nonpartisan lens that describes how our monetary system actually works. MMT clarifies what is economically possible and thus shifts the terrain of policy debates that get hamstrung over questions of financial feasibility. To be sure, the debate is far from over regarding what is or is not economically possible. Professor Kelton and others who have come to similar conclusions divide the nations of the world into two groups: those who issue and rely on sovereign money, and those who rely on the currency issued by other countries or the central banks of other countries. The use of sovereign money has important advantages when circumstances demand spending by government in excess of revenue raised by taxation and other fees charged by government. Professor Kelton challenges the conventional wisdom that governments must first raise money via taxation, then use the money to pay for public goods and services. When the revenue is insufficient, governments traditionally borrow by issuing bonds sold to investors. Mainstream economists see this borrowing as limiting what is available for private investment, acting as a brake on gross domestic product and increasing dependency on foreign investors. This understanding of the situation is wrong, she argues. When one follows the money in the case of the United States, the trail leads to the Federal Reserve System, which creates new money out of thin air used to purchase the government bonds. If the Fed holds the bonds in its portfolio, the money supply is increased. If the Fed markets the bonds to investors, the effect is a transfer of money from private hands to the government and whoever ends up the recipient of government spending. And of course, some of the money comes back to the Treasury in payment of taxes. What should happen, Professor Kelton tells us, is that the federal government should direct the Fed to issue whatever money is needed for essential public goods and services, such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, affordable housing, addressing climate change, and broadening equality of opportunity, or even a jobs guarantee program. However, the Fed is supposed to make decisions about monetary expansion, interest rates charged to banks, and the amount of bank reserves required based on their own analysis of how to balance the goals of low inflation and sustainable economic growth. Stephanie Kelton argues that the Great Recession of 2008 dramatically changed the way the Fed conducts monetary policy. In November 2008, the Fed launched the first of 3 rounds of a massive bond buying program called quantitative easing. By the time it was over, the Fed had gobbled up some $4.5 trillion in bonds. In addition to using quantitative easing to push longer-term interest rates lower, the Fed also changed the way it managed its short-term interest rate. Instead of buying and selling treasuries to add and subtract reserves, the Fed simply started paying interest on reserve balances. Today, the Fed can adjust the short-term interest rate simply by announcing that it will pay a new rate. Moreover, she challenges the conventional views about how government policies of taxing and spending affect economic growth and stability. One of the most significant arguments made is that the use of a sovereign currency eliminates the very idea of a budget deficit. Borrowing by government, that is, the issuance of bonds, becomes therefore a strategy to take excess liquidity out of the private sector when the risk of inflation is evident. The primary reason for taxation, then, is not to raise revenue, but to achieve other socio-political objectives, such as the direction of investment activity. As important, I suggest, is an objective not addressed by Professor Kelton, which is to publicly capture income flows that are unearned, gained from rent-seeking privileges and speculation. She simply acknowledges that taxes are good for altering the distribution of wealth/income, adding, "Set the need for revenue completely aside. One might advocate a wealth tax, higher marginal rates, closing the carried interest loophole, ending step-up in basis, etc., simply because one believes the outcomes, less inequality, are desirable." One of the first detailed analyses of modern monetary theory appeared in the early 1990s in the book The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy by U.S. economist Warren Mosler. Mosler had worked on Wall Street during the 1970s, founding a hedge fund to put his ideas into practical use. His insight was that a country issuing its own currency must spend before its citizens are able to pay taxes in the nation's currency, the supply of which is essentially unlimited. About this, he wrote, "Can the federal government run out of dollars? No, because the Fed could pipe in a bigger number. That number doesn't come from anywhere." Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan essentially confirmed the arguments made by Mosler and others, publicly stating, "There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody." Michael Hudson, one heterodox economist who has a strong understanding of the link between the land and money questions, warns there is a fundamental flaw in the analysis of many MMT theorists. He writes, "Much superficial confusion between the fire sector and the production and consumption economy comes from repeating the oversimplification of the classical monetary formula MV equals PT, namely dividing the economy into private and government sectors. The problem is that this analysis, used by many MMTers, does not distinguish between government spending into the fire sector and asset markets as compared to spending into the real economy on employment and production, including the building of public infrastructure, for instance. Without this distinction, it is not possible to see whether deficit spending is productive by aiming at supporting employment and output, or merely aims at supporting asset prices and making sure creditors do not lose the value of their financial claims on debtors, claims that have become unpayable and thus are a bottomless pit of government deficit spending in the end. And then there are the observations of Australian economist and severe critic of conventional neoclassical economics, Steve Keen. He has in the last few years had a good deal to say about the debate over the validity of MMT, subjecting the hypothesis to mathematical analysis and, quote, standard system dynamics tools of flowchart modeling. What does he conclude? Mainstream economic models of money, both the money multiplier and loanable funds, face humiliation when expressed in terms of double entry bookkeeping. The core tenets of MMT, on the other hand, are derived from the principles of double entry bookkeeping. If the government does not spend more than it takes back in taxation, then it does not create fiat money, and a surplus actually destroys fiat money. Mainstream economists who object to the government running a deficit are in fact objecting to the creation of fiat money. Fiat money gives the non-government sector a means to undertake monetary transactions by exchanging the government's liabilities, fiat money, with each other. Without fiat money, the only liabilities that can be exchanged are those created by the banking sector, credit money. Fiat money creation also increases the net financial worth of the non-government sector, whereas credit-based money does not. I leave it to viewers to go out on the internet and spend some time reading or listening to what he has to say, then make up your own mind whether or not he is onto something. Some economic historians remind MMT proponents that there is a long history of debt monetization leading to hyperinflation. MMT proponents challenge this conclusion. In their textbook on macroeconomics, William Mitchell, L. Randall Wray, and Martin Watts argue, no simple proportionate relationship exists between rises in the money supply and rises in the general price level. Back in 2019, economist Paul Krugman took time out to try to respond in the New York Times to Stephanie Kelton, with whom he had been going back and forth in an exchange of mutual misunderstanding. Krugman requests clear answers to several questions he has. He says, so let's be clear here. Are MMTers claiming, as Kelton seems to, that there is only one deficit level consistent with full employment, that there is no ability to substitute money for fiscal policy? Are they claiming that expansionary fiscal policy actually reduces interest rates? Yes or no answers, please, with explanations of how you got these answers and why the straightforward framework I laid out above is wrong. It is only fair to give the last word to Professor Kelton, although this is certainly far from her last word on the issues. If we really want to make the national debt disappear, the most straightforward option is to simply let the central bank buy up government bonds in exchange for bank reserves. The thing we call the national debt is nothing more than a footprint from the past. What matters is not the size of the debt or who holds it, but whether we can look back with pride, knowing that our stockpile of treasuries exists because of the many, mostly positive interventions that were taken on behalf of our democracy. And with that, I end this very brief analysis of modern monetary theory. I'm sure we'll have more to discuss as time goes by. Thank you.